Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Christian Ginest, and I am the co-chair of UNANCA's Human Rights Committee. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization yet, UNANCA stands for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. We are based in Washington, DC, and we have a little more than 1,000 members. Nearly half of them are students and young professionals who strongly believe that the United Nations is an important tool to foster peace. Now, one of our main objectives as an organization is to advance human rights through educational events like tonight and advocacy. So tonight, we're very grateful to have three experts in the field of child labor who are going to talk about their own efforts to promote human rights in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I hope you have many questions for them. So please do not hesitate to share your questions in the chat or share your recommendations as experts, and we will discuss them during our Q&A session. But before I introduce our exceptional panel, I would like to share a few key facts about cobalt mining by children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and why we should care about this issue here in the United States and beyond. So, to give you a little bit of background, cobalt is a metal that can be found in many of the technologies that we depend upon on a daily basis. And right now, as we are having this conversation, the odds are that your laptop or your smartphone battery is made of cobalt. The cobalt market is expected to grow and will represent approximately $100 billion by the year 2025. But if there is one country that is particularly impacted by this market, it is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That country alone is the source of approximately 60% of the global cobalt supply. Now, this trend is particularly alarming because 40,000 children work in the cobalt mines of the DRC every day. And the average daily income is only $1. So we're talking about a market that is built on the economic exploitation of children and that directly interferes with their human rights, including their right to education as spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the question we are going to tackle tonight is, what can we do as organizations and as global citizens to fight child labor in the cobalt sector of the DRC? Three experts have accepted our invitation to discuss this issue tonight. Our first panelist is Ms. Cristina Duranti. She is the director of the Good Shepherd International Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization committed to protecting and promoting the rights of people living in poverty, affected by human trafficking, migration, gender-based violence, and other violations of human rights. She coordinated the startup of Bon Pasteur Kolwezi, recognized as an international best practice in the eradication of child labor in the cobalt mining areas of the DRC. Our second panelist, Ms. Cristina Villegas, is the Director of Responsible Sourcing and Minerals at Pact, a global nonprofit organization which offices in 40 countries. She is a top global expert in artisanal and small-scale mining, which some of us know as ASM, and is known for her expertise in gemstones, diamonds, and gold. Last but not least, we are delighted to welcome Ms. Amayel Dia, who is a child labor in mining reporting coordinator at Pact. Ms. Dia has been working on the issue of child mining in the DRC since 2018, and she is currently in France. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. My very first question is directed to you, Ms. Duranti. So we're going to talk a little bit about the root causes of child cobalt mining in the DRC. And we know that child labor is the result of many factors, including poverty, social norms, and a lack of decent work opportunities. Could you please talk a little bit about the root causes of child cobalt mining in the DRC specifically, and to what extent can organizations like yours address those deeply rooted problems?
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure being with you and sharing our experience in Kolwezi, the province of Lualaba, the southern part of DRC, which has become recently, as you mentioned earlier, the global capital of cobalt extraction. We've been working in Kolwezi since 2012, when we had started a small program addressed mostly to women and girls and children living in vulnerable conditions. At the time, cobalt was not really a thing yet. So we actually witnessed the development of this cobalt rush, as we can technically define it, making a parallel with what happened at the beginning of last century in California. So what we witnessed was a precondition of extreme fragility of the communities living in and around the Kolwezi area. These communities that we now call artisanal and small mining communities suffered already from serious pre-existing conditions of vulnerability, and particularly these vulnerabilities would affect children, particularly orphans, women and girls. I will just give you a few key points of the findings that we collected when we ran our preliminary assessment before starting our program. So definitely extreme poverty and high food insecurity were at the root of most of the problems that children, girls and women were facing at the time and are still faced with at the moment. The need to integrate unstable and highly volatile household income, which is the case for most of the families living in ASM communities, prompt children, girls, women, in all kinds of conditions to earn a living through mining. Second, I would want to stress a very, very important and at times under remarked element, which is the fact that social protection systems in these communities is really extremely weak. We don't have well-organized, robust social services, child protection systems. The few offices are understaffed, and access to basic rights, especially for children who are orphans, for example, or in the care of elderly grandparents, is basically non-existent. So we found ourselves with this huge number of children orphaned because of the unsafe conditions in which their parents were working, who were absolutely not taken care of. Third, a very weak to non-existent enforcement of the existing laws, because there are laws, there are a number of regulations that would prevent this kind of exploitation on children, child labor, but all kinds of violations of children labor. And so the difficulty of identifying, reporting, and then acting to enforce the law and the regulations that exist and the conventions that DRC government has signed. Fourth point, social fragmentation. We found these communities to be extremely heterogeneous in their ethnic, language composition. So those informal mechanisms of protection that are deeply rooted in these communities were not basically functioning. There was a lot of tension and violence within the communities themselves, because very often these are sort of artificial communities formed by internally displaced people who are looking for quick earnings, and so set up quickly and then not necessarily creating the necessary civic strengthening mechanism that would protect the most vulnerable. Fifth point, chronicle underinvestment in sectors alternative to mining. This is a very, very important point, and I know my colleagues here at Pact would say more about this, but this resource curse that affects a region like this leaves agriculture and the service sector chronically underinvested and underdeveloped, which creates this vicious cycle and creates a workforce, a huge workforce that has no alternatives to very unsafe conditions because they have very, very limited bargaining power, negotiation capacity, and so on. Finally, gender-based violence. I would not stress enough the fact that women and girls in these environments are particular risk. There are social norms connected to that, but it's also, again, a lack of protection mechanisms that made reporting on abuses, on trafficking, on commercial sexual exploitation almost impossible. And just recently, through our program that is trying to address all these different areas of vulnerability, we see that girls and women are coming forward to denounce, to report on cases of violence and abuse and so on. So this is a little bit of an overview of what we've observed as the root causes of child labor and the broader human rights violations that affect these communities.
Thank you, Ms. Duranti. Could you talk a little bit about how your programs are trying to address those deeply rooted issues?
Sure. So for what concerns the condition of children, we have set up community-based mechanisms to create safe spaces for children to develop as children. And that starts with reporting all kinds of cases of abuse and exploitation and create the mechanisms to report first informally through the community coordinating groups. Then we have social workers that take care of the children, especially the most vulnerable, so the orphans and those who are involved in labor, and enroll them in a program that is multidimensional. Starts with food security and then supports the children and the family, where families are there, to be enrolled in an informal schooling program that will help kids being mainstreamed into the formal education system. This is another major issue. Primary school should be free for these children according to the law, but actually it's not free. And so that creates another vicious cycle that prompts kids to go to the mines to earn enough to pay what they need to go to school, which it's a cycle we are trying to break by providing this informal school on a free basis for the kids, where they can get fed and they can get also a proper supervision in terms of their psychological and overall physical development, this healthcare check and so on. On the other end, we work with the mothers, with the women in the communities, the grandmothers, to train them and transfer know-how. And we have started now 10, I think, cooperatives led by women focused on farming. So we have started this women social enterprising project focused on farming. So we're trying to convince the local communities to use land for producing food rather than mining. As you can imagine, this is a big shift and not the easiest, how can I say, pitch to the local investors to put their assets into a less profitable activity. But I just want to give you in a snapshot a simple fact. This is a place, an area where it's easier to trade and buy minerals than farming products. It's extremely difficult and very pricey to purchase eggs or vegetables or fresh produce. So we really strongly believe that our duty as nonprofit and social enterprising operators is to invest and promote these alternative livelihoods, particularly for women and girls.
Thank you. And what I really like about your answer is the emphasis on the local community, which leads me to my second question to you, Ms. Villegas. What role can local civil society play in tackling those deeply rooted challenges? And can you explain how you are currently partnering with local communities and local civil society?
Sure. Thank you for having us on here. It's a really important topic, and I just wanted to praise the good work of the Good Shepherd Foundation over the years. It's been remarkable to see it over time. So brava to Cristina and her team. Just an introduction to Pact. We've been working in Congo for over 20 years, and part of Pact is a very large organization. We, as you said, we have offices in 40 countries. But as one of our values, we work with local organizations. And it's not just a way of getting things done, it's actually a value of ours. And more than half of our work is actually dedicated to building up local capacity, and they graduate. These groups often graduate and then receive direct funding. So the wonderful thing in Congo is that there's a very dynamic local civil society that cares passionately about these issues. And so there's no shortage of talented local activists from which to partner. So Amaya will kind of talk about more about our precise programs. I want to make sure she gets the floor because she's really the one doing everything, honestly, in this topic. But I just want to also just flag that, it's local civil society, but it's also local business that has a role, and especially international business. But we spend a lot of our time working with local business on engaging on, why you shouldn't buy from children. And I know that sounds silly, but it's actually really practical. Sometimes when you see little children mining, it's really tempting to say, oh, here's a little bit of money, but that actually starts perpetuating the cycle. So we, in our work across Congo, whether it's tin and tantalum and tungsten, or cobalt and copper, or other materials, we see child labor everywhere across all these mines. So let's be very clear. This is not only a problem in cobalt. We see this everywhere, and we have experience working on this. So part of our strategy is working with local business on stopping that demand side, and then working on the working with children and their families and regional government on protecting children and getting them out of the mines. And just something that Cristina Duranti said, we're focusing on mothers has been a huge breakthrough. And when you think about it, of course, that makes total sense. But when you engage women and you work on that transition together, typically they don't want to be in mining. If they do, that's their choice. But bringing kids to the site is a different story. So, and also just to say that there's different types of children we tend to see on mine sites. The first type is a child mining with their mother or their father. And that's, usually due to like a lack of childcare options, or just they haven't gone to school themselves, and they simply cannot afford to send their kid to school. And the second group are teenagers that have started their families already, and they might have 2 kids on their back. And then the third group are children who are mining alone or with a third-party adult. And that last group is the most vulnerable. The first group is the biggest with their mothers. And luckily we have had tremendous success, which Amayo can talk about, transitioning these kids and their mothers to other livelihoods. But just overall headline here, this issue is solvable. We know it works, with Good Shepherd, with Pact, with other organizations. We have a lot of learning over the years. The problem is funding. And so I just want to highlight that. It's not an issue that we don't know a lot about. We have to know a lot about it. The issue is funding and scaling up. Thank you. Maybe Amael, you can talk about what we do in the cobalt mines.
Yes, thank you very much, Cristina. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that very glad to be here, of course. And I also wanted to, just prior to answering this question, to focus on something that Cristina Duranti said earlier on. When it comes to agriculture, one of our big success is a vocational education training that we're implementing for adolescent miners aged 15, 17 years old, because we've seen that they are the most economic depending on mining activities. And we're really trying to see how we can retrieve them from mining, but also offering them some sustainable alternatives to mining, as well as in regular income. And for several years now, we've been trying to push them to start working in agriculture, because there's a lot to be done there. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, it is of minor interest to them, and most of the time they're telling us that what they want is the fast money. They want to make sure that if they're working, then they're getting some money at the end of the day. And agriculture, unfortunately, doesn't provide this. So this was just a little parenthesis. Sorry for that, but I just felt that what Cristina said was very, very relevant. In terms of our work with the civil society, we are working with a certain number of civil society organizations within Kolwezi. In 2021, worked with about half a dozen of them. And what we do is mainly three things. First of all, capacity building. As Cristina said earlier, of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all option. So we're really trying to see what kind of needs they have, depending, of course, of their area of expertise and areas of interest. The second thing that we also do with them is that we work with them in partnership within our current programs. They are experts in certain number of fields. They're the ones who know the community much better than we do. So they can really bring a change. And most of the time they are living within the communities. So they really have this impact that us as an international NGO, do not necessarily have. And the last thing also that needs to be remembered is that, as Cristina said, our funding is limited, both in terms of amount of money as well as in terms of timing. And we want to make sure that, when we leave or when our projects are ending, then they are there as well to continue, sustain the achievements that we've been able to implement within the community.
Thank you, Ms. Dia. This is really important, and we will talk a little bit about all those different projects in a few minutes as well. I do have one last question about the root causes of child mining in the DRC, and it is about international companies. So some international companies appear to be one of the reasons, or at least to be part of the demand for cobalt. And so I'm wondering, to what extent have international companies played a role in addressing those root causes as well? And my question goes to you, Ms. Duranti. Oh, you are on mute.
Sorry. Thank you. So I want to say beforehand that I strongly believe, as we mentioned earlier, that the root causes of child labor are primarily connected to development and rights protection issues. Let's be very, very clear about this. And there have been some reports that have come out lately from IAD, AfriWatch, and other colleagues that reaffirm this point that the development issues that pre-exist the mining sector, the specific now commodity that we're talking about, need to be addressed by all duty bearers together. So definitely international companies have a role to play, but we cannot forget the role and the duties of the state party, the civil society, and the communities themselves. Let's look at this as a complex and multidimensional issue. It's, you know, of course, singling out, depending on the trend, the flavor of the time, this or the other scapegoat would not really do much justice to understand this very complex issue. So that said, we need to look at what are the roles and the duties according to the existing regulations, international regulations, and national laws vis-a-vis resolving and addressing this development, rights protection, and responsible business conduct issues. So definitely international companies have a duty, a responsibility to play according to the existing guidelines, from OECD guidelines to UN, the principles on human rights and business, and the new mining code within DRC. This all sets, and Pact is an expert on this, but sets of standards specific to mining for both the large scale, the industrial mining, and the artisanal mining. This is, let's all be very honest, still very much work in progress, particularly in an area, in a context that suffers from weak law enforcement and widespread corruption issues and political instability. So let's not forget the bigger picture here, not to minimize, but to put things in context. What I strongly believe is that international companies have a capacity in terms of investment, critical mass in terms of contracts, and capacity to negotiate, to set rules and to set standards. So those who can play a leadership role in the industry have a duty to do it in terms of putting pressure on the lower tiers of the let's say towards the upstream of the chain, of the value chain. And this is what we are seeing happening within a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives that we're also partnering in, that I have to say are still in an infant stage, and definitely are faced with many challenges and a lot of competing interests that are not easy to reconcile. Civil society is still, it's vibrant and it's alive, but does not have sufficient means and capacity and possibilities to put pressure on governments and companies to play at the same level, let's say, especially local civil society. What I think it's necessary, and there's a number of international NGOs that are doing this very well, from Amnesty to RAID, it's to continue to keep the light on Kolwezi. When we started our work in Kolwezi, no one really knew about it. Only the sector experts, and Pact was there already, but not many other NGOs or international media would have ever heard about it. So now it's in the spotlight. It's going to be in the spotlight for a long time, because batteries are going to be with us for the near future. So let's use this opportunity to continue keep this pressure and spread it across. It's similar to what we've heard from the COP balance of powers. There's a lot of pressure on of media on the Western and the international corporations that have accountability systems, but we need to broaden the scope. There's a lot of business interests that are not as accountable as your let's say more popular names. And so we need to make sure that this pressure does not diminish, because the problem is still there. As Cristina said, we know what works to eradicate child labor in this particular context, but it's still there. It's not gone away despite all the pressure and all the efforts paid. Programs like ours, I speak for Bon Pasteur, but actually we're not an international NGO as such. Bon Pasteur is a local organization. It's staffed only by Congolese professionals. We support them with technical assistance, and they're, I would say, probably the only large-scale provider of very vital social services that are absolutely underfunded in these regions. There's no public funding for orphans or for informal schooling systems, just to give you an example. There's no social workers. You go to the local offices and you might find 1 or 2 social workers in a region that, roughly estimated might have 10 to 15,000 children involved in the worst forms of child labor. So we're talking of an extremely underfunded system. So we need companies to take a responsibility to put pressure on duty bearers where they can do it, and to fund according to their duties to invest in local communities. There are laws around that too, but there's a lot of difficulties in enforcing these laws, and avoid that the funding that should go to development and protection is diverted, let's say, to other interests.
And if I could just come in, we at Pact have been extremely lucky to receive the really generous support of a number of companies over the years. The biggest donors currently are the Responsible Business Alliance and Apple. And these 2 organizations / companies have been remarkable partners over the years, in the hard times, and before this was even a visible international issue, especially Apple. So I want to give credit where it's due. I think it's really easy for people to imagine kind of these villainous big companies not caring about anyone, but I want to give credit where it's due, and our past supporters have included Microsoft, Google, Dell. So there has been some a good amount of investment, but at the same time, those are some of the most visible companies, right? You also have highly visible companies that are trillion-dollar companies, and I haven't seen a penny invested in local issues, and that's shocking. Especially given the popularity of electric vehicles. So I think there's a lot of groups that are, there's a proliferation of these associations that profess to be doing something about child labor or about these conditions. It's like alphabet soup as far as the associations active in the region. And maybe I'll be getting Amiel in trouble, but it's very frustrating because you have these companies that join these things for the appearance of actually doing something, but very few are actually putting money and effort into the actual problem. And again, we know it works. You have a number of partners available. So I just want to call that out. So thank you for the generous support. And it takes both international groups and local organizations, working hand in hand, for lots of reasons: visibility, technical assistance, and protecting one another in the hard times as well.
Thank you both. So as you said, Ms. Villegas, we know what works, and this is, what I would like to focus on for the next 10 minutes. Two different initiatives, or at least types of initiatives that function, are what we call formalization and traceability projects. So my question to you, Ms. Dia, is what do we mean by formalization? For those of us who are not familiar with this concept. And could you please tell us more about formalization projects and how they can impact child labor?
Yes, of course. Thanks. I think that formalization is extremely important. In the DRC, most of the miners that that are mining cobalt, and that we're focusing on, are working in mine sites which are not designated areas where they can actually really mine. They are working individually as well, using tools which are quite rudimentary, really picks and shovels. And the idea around formalization is really to make sure that they are working in what they call ZEA, Zone d'Exploitation Artisanale, artisanal exploitation areas, which are designated by the government as areas for ASM miners. That they're also working together in cooperatives, which also enables them to increase their safety, increase their income, improve as well their way of mining, so they can also mine better and in a safer way. And all of this also participates in the reduction of child labor in mining, because it means that children do not need to go and work in the mines to supplement the household income. So really, it goes together. And here I would like to give you an example, if I just have a 2-3 minutes, of an interesting partnership that we had a few years ago with Trafigura. So Trafigura, which is a commodity trading and logistics company. And basically, they signed an off-trade agreement with a mining company called Shemaf, for cobalt hydroxide. Shemaf was producing some of its cobalt in a neighborhood called Mutoshi. And in this neighborhood, there was about 5,000 ASM miners working there. So they came together, they formed a cooperative called Komiakol, and they were designated an area within the Mutoshi concession where they could actually work in partnership with Shemaf and produce minerals that would be sold to Shemaf. In 2018, we started the project in partnership with Shemaf, Komiakol, Trafigura, as well as relevant government agencies, to make sure that they were able to produce minerals in accordance to OECD due diligence guidance, as well as Trafigura guidance regarding ASM. And so basically, our role in that was to make sure that we identify the different risks that existed at the mine site, but also during the transportation of the minerals towards the processing sites. And we identified a range of risks, of course, and also found solutions. But two of them I would like to focus on right now is, first of all, regarding working conditions of miners, as well as the issue of child labor and illegal miners working on site. So what we did regarding working conditions and labor standards was to make sure that Shemaf provided personal protective equipment free of charge to the Komiakol miners. We also made sure that they were providing support in terms of mechanization to reduce as well the dangers of mining for the Komiakol workers, and also providing health on sites, health facilities, sanitation facilities, water, and much more than that. The second risk that we identified was related to child labor, as well as the interests of illegal miners on site. And for that, we did two main things. First of all, making sure that the concession where the ASM miners were allowed to work only had one entrance, that people who could enter this entrance were wearing PPEs and also were able to show ID cards. The second thing that we did was also working at community level. And this is where I'm saying that formalization or really goes hand in hand with projects to end child labor in mining. Because in those communities, we did three things. First of all, awareness raising around the issue of child labor in mining, around children's rights, around positive parenting, to make sure that we change social norms and standards regarding child labor in mining. Then we also work with vulnerable families that were at risk of sending their children to work in the mines. And here we're really focused on economic empowerment of those families, enable them to better save money, but also to take loans. Because one of the things that we haven't said so far is that actually the banking system is quite inexistent in those communities, and those community members don't really have access to that. So how do you start a business, or how do you do something else when you can't invest, or when you can't have the money to be able to do that? And the last thing that we did, with which I've already touched base upon a few minutes ago, was this vocational education training that we are providing for adolescent minors aged 15 to 17 years old. I'm not going to go into the details of this program, but the essential thing to know is that through this, we've been able to train over 700 former adolescent miners, and that a very, very low percentage of them are going back to mining after they have become tailors, welders, auto and motor mechanics, carpenters, and other trades like that. And in terms of results, what we saw is that we saw improved safety conditions at the mining site, improved access to health in general within the community. We also saw that there was a huge increase in the number of businesses that were started in the community because there was more money now. So there was a higher demand. And finally, we also saw that women that were working at the mine sites were actually earning 2.5 times more than those that were working in similar conditions, but outside of the mine sites. So all of this to say that it really goes together, and that without formalization, we can implement a range of projects to end child labor in mining, but formalization really also answers one of the root causes of child labor.
Thank you, Ms. D. I think it's amazing to hear about the impact you're having, and the way that you are able to quantify this impact is really impressive. So thank you so much. The other question I had was about traceability. So why is it so difficult for businesses to assess whether child labor occurs in their production chain? And how can nonprofit organizations increase supply chain traceability?
I think that there's a few reasons, of course, but I will also ask Cristina to the two Cristinas answer to that as well. Well, first of all, there's many actors in the supply chain before we get to the end product. I mean, just in the DRC, for instance, cobalt is mined in different mine sites. Then the cobalt is purchased at buying centers. Then it is sent to processors. Then it is sent to exporters. So already here you've got a lot of cobalt coming from different areas, which is being mixed. Then it will go to China, where cobalt from different countries also comes and is also being mixed. Another thing as well is that it's very rare that companies are sourcing from one single site, such as the example that I was providing you earlier on regarding the Trafigura and Shepard example. And also downstream companies are not required anyways to trace their supply chain up to the mine sites. So all of this is making it quite difficult to get those information and this traceability. And this is actually also why, as Pact, anyways, and many NGOs are part of multi-stakeholder international organizations where they can do this kind of advocacy as well, because it is important to make sure that people are able to trace the minerals up to the mine sites. And we're also supporting companies who wish to make sure that their supply chain is clean, such as Trafigura, but there's many others.
Thank you. This is extremely helpful. My last question will be addressed to you, Ms. Duranti, and to you, Ms. Villegas. and it's about government funding. So you've already talked a little bit about this issue, which is absolutely critical. We know that nonprofit organizations like yours rely on government funding and voluntary contributions to carry out their missions and achieve their goals. So should government agencies allocate more resources to formalization or to tackling child cobalt mining in particular? And how can we as individuals, as citizens, help your organizations? And we're going to start with you, Ms. Duranti.
Well, I would make a clear distinction here. There's definitely a duty of governments to provide for access of basic human rights and children's rights. And this is absolutely not a hold in this context. So let's be clear that funding from government, from international aid should definitely be focused on access to basic rights for children, which would already be an extremely important element to prevent child labor. Let's be frank, even if by magic, tomorrow all the mining companies, the ASM cooperatives were able to make sure there were no children in their sites and make sure there are no children, the regulatory bodies can make sure there's no children outside the mining sites. Children would still need to be fed, to go to school, to have a family to take care of them. And formalization and traceability and improvement of the mining extractive practices would not tackle this problem. And so the two things must be looked at from the two different perspectives. So there's a duty to support social protection services and access to basic rights for these children, which is at the moment not fulfilled. There's a lot of attention, and rightly so, I would definitely agree, around investing on formalization and traceability, and these things are definitely important and connected to the development side of the problem. But still, if we allow what happens outside the fence of the mining concessions not to change, we will never eradicate the problem, and we will continue to have social issues. Today's child labor, tomorrow will be trafficking or something else, where the poverty and development problems will end up moving towards. So I would say we have a duty to keep advocating for funding for this basic social protection and rights access for particularly the most vulnerable section of the population. On the other end, international companies have a disproportionate capacity to influence the political and state actors as well as the local providers. So there has to be a more focused pressure on investing in diversification, alternative livelihoods, and support mechanism for communities. Otherwise, I'm really afraid that we're going to feed into the process of finding ways to mitigate risks for companies, but not resolving the social and development issues that are at the root of the problems we're discussing today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Ms. Villegas, before you share your response, I would like to remind everyone that you can share your questions in the chat, and we are going to have a Q&A session in a few minutes. So please, if you have any questions, any clarification questions or recommendations to share, please feel free to share them in the chat. Ms. Villegas, so could you please tell us more about, government funding and what government agencies can do to help nonprofit organizations like yours?
Yeah, when we say government, let's be clear about what governments we're talking about. I would love to see additional funding from the Congolese government, but I recognize there's a lot of competing priorities and challenges. Raising funds for its own account. I agree with Cristina in that we shouldn't be asking other government funders to pay for traceability. That is something that global companies, whether they're working with an association or whether they're on their own, they should be as a business cost. And unfortunately, as many supply chains are set up, the incentive is to pay as little as possible. Regulations for other materials like the Dodd-Frank Act has forced traceability in other materials in Congo, but it has left out cobalt and copper. I think that's one of the reasons that we're not seeing as much focus on the traceability element. It's totally within the budgets of these large companies. Again, these are billion, if not trillion-dollar companies. That touches many industries, as you pointed out in your opening remarks. But as Cristina also mentioned, these issues are bigger than just cobalt, and they pre-existed cobalt mining. There needs to be a coordinated effort from companies to take responsibility for the supply chains, because there can be so much more work that can be done. And then interested governments who also want to help the people of Congo in very many ways that are needed. I think there's space for everyone, and making sure that Congolese voices direct that, and are central part of that action is, I think, one of the things that we really need to focus on as responders.
Thank you, Cristina. So now we are going to take a few minutes to answer our participants' questions. I see that there is a question from Patrick Realisa, which is about the Chinese government. The question is focused on, let me see, the role of China in the region. Could you please tell us a little bit about the role of China and how they can have an impact on child mining in the DRC? And the floor is open.
Go ahead, Cristina.
Yeah, sure. From our observation point, definitely the Chinese investments at all scales, from the smaller to the largest, has had a tremendous impact, and it's still having a great impact. And I would say it's the subgroup of investors that probably we have more difficulties in having an open dialogue with. They've been part of initiatives to look at standards and to look at ways to invest in responsible mining, but I have to say we found it very difficult to establish a common ground, I would say. We commissioned a study 3 years ago with a professor from Columbia University, an expert on child protection. And it was interesting how he framed the model that he observed of how these Chinese investors were connecting to the local labor force. And he defined it as a form of a Uber model of mining. So there was so little investment in infrastructures and actually creating a workforce connected to the mining extraction, but simply, getting the concession and onboarding casual temporary workforce that would receive very, very little in terms of payment, but also of safety and security. This was 4 years ago, and I would say some of these players have improved their ways of working, but there's a sort of a mushrooming effect. There's so many new ventures, and it is really difficult to see a systemic improvement, I would say, in the way this companies dialogue at international level with the other players and at the local level. It's still extremely tense and difficult to find a common ground.
Yeah, China, I think it's easy to kind of villainize, the kind of newest player in the mining sector in Africa. There's been a whole queue of people who have come, of countries have come through, and I think China is just the latest. I think there's a couple of things happening. First, that the business culture, is kind of old school, and I think we need to do. I think we, as a kind of international community, need to do more outreach in Mandarin, and go to them, because what I've noticed is a lot of these international convenings are in English or in French, and I know that groups like the OECD have specific China outreach, but I think we need to do more on that side. The other thing to say is that sometimes these areas are really risky. And that's where we're seeing Chinese investment come in and taking over these concessions. And so, they're there. I think in order to make change, we have to have their downstream clients, the brands and others, make it clear about their expectations on site and visit the site, and not just kind of allow people just to promise things, but actually follow up beyond just these assurances.
Thank you, Ms. Villegas, and thank you, Ms. Duranti. This is definitely relevant to the issue. So I would like to thank all of you for your questions, and I would like to thank the panel for sharing your insight with us. This concludes our event. I hope you all enjoyed the opportunity to learn more about child labor in the DRC. I know I certainly did. We did our best to make this event collaborative, and your input will help us design an advocacy plan, which will in turn guide our action in the months to come. So please feel free to share your comments with us. You can find our contact information on our website, UNANCA. And if you are interested in supporting our advocacy efforts here in Washington, D.C., or if you would like to help us draft our advocacy proposals, please do not hesitate to contact us. Remember that no matter where you come from or what background is yours, your voice matters and can make a difference. So everybody in the room is invited to join us next month for our Human Rights Awards, which will take place virtually on December 8th, from 4:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. So thank you, Ms. Duranti. Thank you, Ms. Villegas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dia, for staying up so late with us. And I hope you all have a great evening and a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.